I've had this question on my mind lately, which is just as a business grows, how does it intentionally avoid bureaucracy and slowing down from, too many people involved in individual decisions, or how does it avoid becoming too afraid of taking risks or too worried about making mistakes and things like this, right? Like all of the advantages of a startup or a small company or a small team working together, how do you ensure that many of those can remain in place even as a company grows to 500 or 1,000 employees? And I think many companies have tried various methods, right? Like Zappos, the shoe company, they tried basically something called holacracy, where they would have small teams interconnected, but they wouldn't have a direct manager or anything like that. So you wouldn't necessarily run your decisions past someone, but you would work within teams, and if you needed help, you could ask for help. But for the most part, you were trusted to deliver results and get your job done, and you had a fair bit of autonomy to make decisions and take risks on behalf of the company. And I think that's really important because if you think about it, when you have a team of, say, four people, and let's say each of them owns a fourth of the company, they're all willing to take risks on behalf of the company and make decisions, and they're all willing to trust each other because they're equal partners. But when you have like 1,000 employees working together, a natural hierarchy tends to set in, and Zappos's use of holacracy was meant to dismantle the hierarchy. But I think it's natural for hierarchy to exist in terms of like, okay, you have more experience, so let me defer to you, or you've done this more, or you're just naturally more skilled at this, you've researched it more, whatever it might be, right? You're more interested in the subject, so let me defer to you on that. But I think it makes much more sense for hierarchies to be based on competence rather than just purely experience or status or even equity, right? Like it doesn't make a lot of sense necessarily to only defer to people who have equity because they aren't necessarily more qualified or meritorious to make that decision or that call. It makes much more sense to try to create an environment where people can disagree openly and suggest alternatives and try to make things better over time, right? And this is what Ray Dalio is doing with his company. He says he's trying to create an idea meritocracy. And I think in many ways he succeeded based on what he's shown us. They're heavily data driven. They track a lot of attributes. They get feedback from everyone, on a live basis using their tablets. They're like entering in, as a meeting is happening, they're entering in feedback on how things are going. And so everybody is constantly being evaluated by everybody else. And over time, people improve from that level of analysis and feedback. And I think the other nice thing about that style of environment is that you are encouraged to be honest in a genuine way. In a lot of companies, they will pay honesty lip service, but when you're actually honest, you get punished for it, especially if what you have to say disagrees with the status quo or makes your boss look bad or things like that. But in a company like Dalio's, actually, if it makes your boss look bad because they've been making a mistake or they're wrong about something, they actually encourage that and they celebrate it, and even the boss is happy about it, which I think is really cool, right? Like imagine an environment where people are happy to discover that they're wrong because they realize that they were paying the cost of being wrong this entire time, and it's only when someone showed them that they now have a chance to correct it and improve it. But I do think for a lot of businesses, one of the best things they can do is remain intentionally small unless they want to be in a big business, right? Like if you just want to have a small team and work in a small team, you can do that. You can outsource a lot of things to contractors if you need to. You can implement AI if it helps. But for the most part, you don't need to hire a lot of people, right? Like Jonathan Stark talks about this, where he prefers being a solo freelancer, solopreneur. And that's because he doesn't necessarily want to be managing or hiring people. And he sees a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that the only way to grow your business is to hire people. But that's not always the case, right? There are other ways to grow. And even if you have a business that makes more money, you may not be happier because now you are a manager rather than an entrepreneur, right? And not everybody is going to enjoy management as much as they enjoyed entrepreneurship or freelancing or whatever it was beforehand. But it is important to draw a distinction and the line for yourself. For me personally, I have no idea how big a company I necessarily want to be in, but I think I'm leaning towards a smaller size for the most part, because a lot of issues that plague bigger companies are not just bureaucracy, but also just an overall average lower quality of employee. And it's interesting to see how some companies manage to maintain like a very high profitability per employee, like Valve. and they have a culture that really seeks competence and encourages people to grow and doesn't really settle for mediocre employees, which I think is really important because if you even have like one mediocre employee surrounded by a bunch of competent ones, it makes everyone else feel kind of punished for doing a better job. And if they can coach that mediocre employee and the employee wants to get better and they can grow, then that's great. But often what happens is it actually ends up dragging everyone else's motivation down, and people just tend to work less hard or work less creatively, and they tend to feel worse off for having, like, they start to wonder, like, why is this person here? Why are they on my team? Why do I have to put up with their incompetence? Why do I have to fix their mistakes? Why do I have to carry that extra load? But all of that, I think, can basically just be summed up as figure out what kind of business you want to be in and then work intentionally to build that business from the ground up, right? Like if you want to be like Ray Dalio and implement those measures, you can do that. You can say, I want radical honesty and radical transparency. If you want something different, you can say that. Like the nice thing about business is it's completely your playground, right? You get to set the rules, you get to set the vision, and all you have to do is communicate them clearly enough and regularly enough that people understand. And so when you go to hire someone or work with someone, you can say, hey, this is how we run our company. We want to make sure you're on board with that. Otherwise, we're not a good fit, and that's okay, right? They can work somewhere else that does things differently. But I think a lot of companies are not intentional enough about their culture, and they're not intentional enough about how they want to be run. And so they end up kind of being bland and just being guided by the loudest voices, which aren't always the most competent.